Welcome back to the 27. For those of you who were disappointed by the seemingly lackluster one-year anniversary content update a few weeks ago, all is right with the world again. The second half was released yesterday with another historically significant F1 retro car, as well as a host of other fixes and revisions. Let's go over the update description directly from Renato Simeoni. I think it's worthy of a read, don't you? After that, we'll highlight some of the updates bulleted from patch 1140, so let's begin. Automobilista 2 version 1140 is now live. This time, our usual complimentary update has evolved into a major mid-month update in its own right, featuring another large batch of improvements and one fantastic new piece of content, the Brabham BT46B. As with the 1997 McLaren MP4-12 and its extra steer brake pedal released last year, Automobilista 2 version 1140, getting crazy with the ones, pays tribute to another unique car in motorsports history, the Brabham BT46B, aka the fan car, made into folklore for its creative implementation of ground effects at the dawn of the new aero revolution during the late 70s. Designer Gordon Murray, actually he's kind of famous, came up with the concept while attempting to boost the performance of the BT46 against the mighty Lotus 79, which had been dominating the 1978 F1 season up until then, under the pretense of improving airflow and cooling through the drivetrain, which it actually also did. The fan in the BT46B would blow faster as the engine revved up, and as it did, it would suck the air from underneath the car, generating astronomical levels of downforce in the process. The car raced only once, the Swedish GP of 1978, and duly won it in dominating fashion at the hands of Niki Lauda. Bernie Ecclestone, who owned the Brabham team and at the time was also beginning to take a leading role in the newly formed F1 Constructors Association, decided to retire the concept to avoid stirring a feud with other constructors. Sell out. Contrary to common misconception, the BT46B was never banned or deemed illegal and went into retirement with the distinct achievement of winning 100% of the races it entered, which was one. Now the Brabham BT46B has been brought back to life in Automobilista 2 to continue taking the fight to the Lotus 79 for ground effect supremacy. There it is, the great BT46B, a really, really weird car that comes from an era in F1 where the gray areas accounted for more pages in the rulebook than the rules themselves. If you were alive back then and watched F1 and missed one race, you might have missed it. But here we are, and we have the chance to drive this sucker. See what I did there? Well, thank you anyway, Renato. All right, let's move into the game updates themselves, where I'm going to pull what stood out for me. Renato broke it down to general, UI, HUD, physics, AI, tracks, vehicles, all these different little fixes here and there. They don't seem to have any overarching principle changes to the physics, so that's good. Just a lot of tweaks to a lot of different cars. So let's begin. Starting off with general, this is big time. And it has to do with duplicate liveries when you're driving against the AI. They've entered a setting that made it so no matter what, whenever you start a grid of cars, there will never be a duplicate livery on the grid. They've also excluded the AI from selecting your livery. So that means when you're driving in a single-player race, you'll never have to pass yourself ever again. Moving on to the UI and HUD, some really interesting fixes here. First and foremost, they fixed the pit and formation speed limit and cooldown lap notice, not enabled by default in some modes. This sporadically comes up for me every once in a while. We tried to do a rolling start in our league last week, and it turned out pretty sketchy because no one knew how fast they needed to go, so that would be really important. They also merged and rearranged the car info widget into a single element. I think there was some changes there, some improvements. They fixed the relative time widget to be enabled during the light mode HUD editor. They restyled the HUD pit board. They also did some other opacity changes. They extended the pause menu and added full-size photos here and there. They changed some colors here and there. But generally, some nice little quality of life fixes for the UI and HUD. Moving into the physics and AI, the only overarching change that they made to the physics of all the vehicles was with regards to unsprung mass values. So unsprung mass is anything that's attached to the car that's not held up by the springs, meaning, you know, the wheels, basically. They did some tire tread adjustments to the Formula Retro, Formula Vintage. They disabled pit stop refueling in Formula Risa and Formula Ultimate. They did some error revisions to the Retro Generation 1, Generation 2. And then it looks like they made a lot of setting changes, allowing the settings to be different, but not necessarily changing the defaults. They did this with the F Classic, front ride height, Porsche GT3R, reduced the minimum rear ride height, which no one uses anyway. They revised the suspension rates for the Formula Retro, reduced gearbox wear for sequential and semi-automatic boxes, adjusted front wing max height for the Retro. That looks like they did a lot of F1 work here. They adjusted the critical RPM range for engine lifetime in GT1, GT3, GT4s. That's good for endurance racing. And then they made some default settings adjustments to the Retros, the MRX and Camaro SS, where they changed the coast ramp angle. They also increased the default preload setting for the Sigma F1. So a lot of little tweaks to all of these little cars. One major thing here, though, is they added a blown diffuser to the Formula Risa. Okay, so the blown diffuser is what makes the BT46B work as far as inside the physics of the game. And since they made it there, they just added it to the Formula Risa. Now, in my opinion, this is going to increase the rear downforce of the Formula Risa cars and probably make it feel like they're going to be pushing during mid to high speed cornering. So you might be able to just reduce some rear wing if that's the case, just because of that added extra downforce from the blown diffuser. Before we move on, let's touch on the AI improvements. Calibration passes for GT5, Ginetta G40, Formula Retro Gen 1, Gen 2, Mini, Stock Car 2020, 2021. That's always good to know. And then another big one for AI is they adjusted AI awareness versus the player again. So this continues to be tweaked for the better. Let's hit upon the track changes now. So they made it so that the trackside crowd is going to be less during practice than it would be for the race. That's good for immersion. They made changes to Spielberg Historic, Londrina, Goiânia, Interlagos, Jacarepagua, Hockenheim, Imola. Most importantly, to all these tracks, they improved the performance pass by over 20%. So that means, I think, less work that your computer has to do when rendering these tracks. Moving on to vehicles, looks like they added camber values and suspension animations to a bunch of cars. The G1M1, G2M1, G2 M3, Formula Risa, Formula Ultimate 2019, and the F3 and F309. They also updated liveries for the Stock Car 2021 series after some managers complained to Risa. Julio Campos, Rafael Suzuki, and Bruno Baptista are now included. Oh, this is cool. They introduced period-accurate helmets and suits and gloves to Formula Retros, Classics, and V12. That's awesome. And then they also fixed the Lotus 79 RPM shift light range, which I noticed, but I didn't mention it on the video that I did on that car. So that's pretty neat. So that's it. 1140 for you boys. I can't wait to jump into the BT46B for a test run. I'm planning on releasing a video on that at any time as soon as it's done. I'm going to be comparing some telemetry data between that car and the Lotus 79 and the contemporary Retro side by side. So that's going to be interesting to see how the blown diffuser affects aero on those cars. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you next time.